So hello, my name is Andrew Pepper-Parsons. I'm Head of Policy for the whistleblowing charity Public Concern at Work. And my background is in law, so I did a law degree. And I've been 10 years at the charity now. I started off as an advisor, so I still do, but I speak to whistleblowers every day, giving them advice. And I seem to have progressed from sort of giving legal advice to whistleblowers to talking to larger groups about whistleblowing. So my role is to head up the policy side of the charity's work. And today I'm going to talk about sort of whistleblowing and adult safeguarding, adult safeguarding, beg your pardon. And I'm going to run through sort of views and experiences of whistleblowers who have come through our organisation for advice in terms of them raising adult safeguarding. So just a brief introduction to us as a charity. We've been around since 1993. We run a free confidential advice line that's legally privileged. So anyone from any sector, any industry who has concerns in their workplace to do with wrongdoing, malpractice or some sort of risk, they can come to us and get advice, and it's legal advice. But we're not a law firm, so it's based on the way we think about it, and maybe a legal way of thinking about it, it's the public interest concern. So it's the thing that affects maybe the service users or the organisation. And those experiences feed into the support that we give to organisations. We fund ourselves through providing training and consultation to organisations. We don't apply for grants. We don't take money from the government in terms of research. That's how we fund our activities. And again, those experiences with whistleblowers informs the work that I do around public policy. And we promote public interest whistleblowing laws around the UK. The UK has, on the statute books, a piece of what is considered to be sort of, I would say, I suppose the gold standard, if that's not too sort of too grand a term to state, about a whistleblowing law that protects whistleblowers through employment law. So if a whistleblower is victimised, they can go to employment tribunal, and that applies across all sectors, and again across a real wide range of wrongdoing. But I thought I'd start, before I get into the sort of my main body of my talk, to give a definition of what we mean by whistleblowing. So, and this is the definition that we use on the advice line. So when we're talking to individuals, this is the criteria we apply to the situation to figure out if we can advise them. So it is where someone is a worker, they're raising a concern about wrongdoing, malpractice in their workplace, to someone in authority. So that can either be, there's an important part here, which is someone either internally to the organisation, so that can be line manager to the very top of the organisation, or externally to regulators, to the media, to MPs. So that's what we're talking about. It's not about the seriousness of the concern, so it can be from sort of money being stolen from a till to, really serious adult safeguarding issues such as neglect or abuse. And it can be to internal or external bodies. There's not a definition there. And it's really where someone is, a witness to wrongdoing, malpractice. And just to go into a bit more detail about the advice line itself, just to give you an idea of what we're dealing with, we've advised so far, since 1993, 21,000 whistleblowers. We get around 2,500 calls a year, and around 60% of that, those calls match that definition that I put up on the screen. And so the other part is usually sort of grievance type issues, employment issues, because the Public Interest Disclosure Act works within, is based in employment law. Effectively, we do get people coming through who don't necessarily fit that kind of definition. And in terms of, so to give you an idea of some of the sectors, the sort of biggest sectors in terms of call volumes, it tends to be health and care tend to be the two top sort of sectors, followed by education and charities, and then financial services. And in terms of the top concern, it's usually financial malpractice, followed by public safety, and patient safety, which is probably a reflection of the fact that health is kind of our top sector, but also finally safeguarding issues are a prominent feature of our call volumes. So to get into the main body of what I'm going to talk about, I've put up this little graphic because basically what I did, and this is kind of something I've not done in this kind of format before as a presentation, but it's a bit of research almost. So I've gone back into the case files, and I've kind of tracked themes and trends from whistleblowers who sort of go through our advice service, if you like. And basically what I've done is each call produces a note that we have to take through the Solicitors Regulatory Authority. And we developed with Greenwich the Whistleblowing Inside Story. We took 1,000 cases from all sectors over a time period of, we published a research in 2013, so we took cases from 2009 to 2010, and we developed a codebook and tracked through the kind of written note sort of trends that might exist. And then we put it through, then Greenwich ran it through some statistical analysis, and we had some trends. So for this talk, I've used that methodology, developed a codebook with my colleague Harry, who's just over there, and we looked at adult safeguarding concerns, so people who are raising those type of issues, which are recorded on a database. And I've compared that, I've run the same analysis through child safeguarding cases, and we took a year. So we ran the cases from the 1st of the 1st, 2016 to the 30th of May. Oh, that's not quite a year, it's probably a bit more, sorry. We came up with about a sample of 200 cases. So that's the sample size, is sort of around that mark for what I'm about to talk about in terms of the different trends. So to start off, I thought it would be a good idea to have an idea of the profile of a whistleblower that comes through raising concerns about adult social care. So adult safeguarding, sorry, and child safeguarding. So this focuses on the, obviously, people raising adult safeguarding issues. So the vast majority of people who sort of raised concerns with us came from the private sector. So 68% of people came from the private sector. And within that, about 55% of people worked in a care home setting. So that gives you an idea of the kind of the sector they work in. Most of them were non-managerial roles. So they described themselves as either carers or social workers. So that was about 65% of the callers coming to us. And so I suppose the way to think about that, the way I was thinking about that was that they may lack a formal set of powers within the organisation. So maybe they've come across something that they can't actually deal with, and so they're themselves, so they're looking to try and raise that as an issue. They're also tend to be a fresh pair of eyes. And what I mean by this is they tend to be new starters within the organisation. So 59% have worked there less than 2 years. And within that 59%, 30% have worked there less than 6 months. And that is a common feature of whistleblowing. So if we go back to the inside story, we found that 39% of whistleblowers in the inside story had less than 2 years service. And that's been picked up as well as in terms of a whistleblowing review in the NHS by Sir Robert Francis. He found the students were often raising concerns. And the kind of rationale for that is that obviously a new member of staff might come across practices that maybe someone who's been in the organisation a long time just accepts as part of the working practices. And so they're maybe more likely to kind of challenge things that have sort of gone on before. Moving on to the type of concerns that are raised within this particular area. The most prevalent one was for adult safeguarding is neglect issues. So that made up 24%. And neglect issues tend to be, the most serious would be obviously sort of the denial of food or water, or the kind of the pads not being changed. We don't work on a legal definition, it has to be said. We're not, as I said, we're sort of a legal charity in the whistleblowing sphere, so we are going by the judgment of the callers a lot of the time and kind of applying a bit of common sense rather than a legal definition to these things. The second most common kind of concern raised was safeguarding practices. That's 22%. And they tend to be, in my experience, they tend to be sort of CRB check issues, or the fact that maybe incidents aren't being reported properly. So that hopefully gives you an idea of the profile. So next to move on to a bit more, so this is a graph obviously, that Harry lovingly had prepared. This is looking at where the concerns have been raised. So where within the organisation, where within the sort of structure have people raised their concerns. It should be pointed out that this is a snapshot, this is not an outcomes graph, this is more a snapshot of when the whistleblower comes to us to get advice, where have they been sort of before they've reached us. So just before we get into this, it should be pointed out that nearly 90% of the whistleblowers that approach us in this for adult safeguarding issues, they've raised their concerns already. And that is really very high compared to, well, 80% in child safeguarding, and across all sectors it was 68% of people, so from the inside story, 68% of individuals before contacting us for advice had raised concerns. So where have they taken their concerns? Well, the vast majority have gone internally. So when we talk about, so 63.9% have gone to managers. When we talk about that, that's usually supervisor or line manager. That's what we mean by that definition. Whereas across a little bit further across, senior manager, executive, 22.9%, they tend to be either more senior managers who are outside the local management, or owners or executives, so very much a kind of outside the line management. But generally speaking, the vast majority of people are going sort of within their organisation. There is a slight, there's a little bit of this change in data between child and adult in the sense that 12% of people went to a prescribed regulator, and that's sort of doubled when you look at child safeguarding. And what we mean by prescribed regulators is our regulatory body that sits outside the sort of line management. And I'm not sure why that would be, actually. It might be that, the thing I was thinking about was maybe it was that the NSPCC, something like that, has a bigger profile maybe than some of the regulators that sit in the space in adult safeguarding. Or it could be that, picking up on some of the things that were talked about in the last presentation about the kind of profile of adult safeguarding compared to child safeguarding. I'm not sure. This is one of the quirks of the data I haven't had a chance to dig into. I think we'd probably have to look at sort of case studies if we were to sort of go into this a bit more detail to kind of tease those things out. Next, I'm going to move on to the response to the whistleblower. So this is the response to the individual who's raised the concerns. Again, this is a snapshot of their experience as they come to us for advice. And so the first thing to point out is obviously the highest, for adult safeguarding, the highest response is no response from managers or co-workers. So what we mean by this is that they have not experienced any form of victimisation from either their co-workers or from the management for raising concerns. Whistleblowing is, it's part of this point about collaboration in the sense that if you have an open environment within the workplace, an open culture, you can raise concerns and they'll be addressed. There is a point of challenge to it as well, so it has a harder edge, obviously. And sometimes, unfortunately, managers react badly to that. And that is reflected here in the data in the sense that, well over half of all the whistleblowers that come to us in this space have experienced some sort of victimisation or dismissal or have been bullied or victimised by co-workers. So what I mean is victimisation obviously is things that fall short of full dismissal, so maybe formal disciplinary, denial of resources, that kind of thing, or being bullied by co-workers to the point where they've been dismissed, either for blowing the whistle or maybe on some other kind of ground that the employers managed to find. I think this is this is quite stark, obviously, in terms of what we're talking about, but I think there's a couple of things to say. One, it's an ongoing problem, that's why the law exists. Secondly, I would say our sample is a little bit biased in the sense we're a whistleblowing charity giving advice, so our sample is not necessarily reflective of the workforce, it's a reflection of the callers coming to us for advice, if that makes sense. Just one more thing, and finally, I haven't included resigned in the victimisation section because I think resignation is actually quite complicated. Some people will be forced to resign, there's no doubt, that's victimisation. Other people will make a positive step to remove themselves because they've blown the whistle and they don't wish to work in the organisation, or they've resigned for other reasons, they've got another job, and now they want to raise the concerns because they've moved themselves in the organisation. So I think the resign kind of point is a little bit more complicated than just sort of lopping it in with victimisation. Yeah. Oh, sorry, just to move back, sorry. Just one more thing, which I forgot to say. So, obviously, something else to draw in terms of if people here are part of regulators or organisation. The thing to worry about this is that obviously the outcome for the whistleblower is tragic for them, because they've come forward. They should be seen as a positive thing. Whistleblowing should be seen as like a gift from management. I was struck by what the CQC, was it Ursula? Yeah. The CQC inspector said about whistleblowing being a failure is kind of not I kind of understand what she means, because I think if the CQC are having whistleblowers coming through to them, maybe something internally has failed. I kind of get that, because she's part of the regulatory body. But I would probably say that whistleblowers are a source of information. They're a gift to managers or to regulators, because they're telling you something that you might not know. And that might be really important in terms of the operation of the organisation or the operation of the sector more generally. And what's more, I think for organisations especially, an act of victimisation isn't just tragic for that individual, which is bad enough. It can have an impact on the organisation, because survey work has shown that amongst the general public, obviously retaliation is a barrier to them raising concerns. If they become aware of a colleague who's been victimised or forced out or dismissed for raising concerns, that will have a rippling effect through the workforce, and it will mean that other future concerns will not be raised up through the system. And so it can have a dampening effect. So moving on to response to the concern itself. So the kind of, the response to the substance of the concerns that have been raised. Again, obviously this is not a final outcome. It is a snapshot of what's happening. Especially in this area, actually. I mean, in terms of sort of the way our advice line operates, some people will come for a discrete bit of advice and move on and raise the concerns. Other callers I've been talking to for years, because the thing's been rumbling on. So we don't always have a full set of kind of outcomes for everybody that comes across and uses our service. That's something for us to look at as an organisation as well. But again, as we can see, the most common response from the employer to concerns raised with them is that they feel that it's been ignored. Just a brief description about that. When we talk about it being ignored, it can usually fall within one of two categories. One is the wrongdoing is repeated. So if we go back to the negligence issue, if they reported like pads maybe not being kind of changed properly, and you report that, and then that practice repeats itself, you could tell, we could say, well, the management's clearly not listened to my concerns or not acted on it. The second point might be a feedback issue, in the sense that if it's maybe a conduct of a staff member or a medical issue, and the whistleblower is kind of like, well, this person's still working in the care home, there's a kind of a feedback point in the sense that maybe the employer has kind of looked into it and decided to keep that person on, but use some other method short of dismissal in terms of dealing with that individual. And they haven't been able to feed that back in terms of back to the whistleblower. And like a lack of feedback can sometimes mean that a whistleblower feels their concerns have been ignored. So that kind of ignored point is kind of, for organisations, is one about obviously dealing with the concern itself, or about feeding back some sort of feedback to the whistleblower, even if there's no details about what's happened, but sort of thanking them for coming forward. But in terms of, for this graph and comparing it to child safeguarding issues, it's interesting to note that there seems to be a point of comparison between the ignored figures in child safeguarding and then the kind of investigation figure, which is a lot lower in adult safeguarding than in child. And it seems like child safeguarding, it's a higher rate of people reporting that the concern is being investigated. Now, I don't know what the outcome of that investigation is. I don't know if the whistleblower here thinks that it's good or bad. I mean, but it is interesting to know, and I don't really know why there's such a disparity in that kind of data. And I could probably hazard a guess that it might be a similar thing, profile of the issue, that kind of thing. Maybe a training issue around this. There might be a lot more training in child safeguarding. I don't know. Until, obviously, again, digging into the cases and trying to find some case studies might elaborate that. But it's something that's kind of been flagged up in the data. And again, I mean, again, this point around whistleblowers feeling that their concerns are being ignored, again, it's kind of, it's frustrating for the individual. In fact, an organisation that purposefully, willfully kind of ignores a concern as a means of punishment for a whistleblower is going to be pulled up in front of the tribunal. So it would be a case that a whistleblower could take forward and get compensation for what they call detriment. But I think there's a wider significance for the organisation that if there's a feeling among staff or a perception that managers are not going to listen to concerns, there's no point raising it with them. Again, that will dampen concerns. Again, that's been identified in survey work that we've done, that is a barrier to people raising concerns. The idea that nothing will happen, well, there's no point in me raising it, nothing will happen. Again, it will have kind of ripple out from the organisation and have a wider context, a wider kind of problem for the sector even, if that happens. If I just tie together the sort of some conclusions, some early conclusions from the data. So whistleblowers tend to be junior and new to the organisation. I mean, that's quite clear, so there's a fresh pair of eyes to the incident. The majority of whistleblowers have raised their concern internally. I think that's really interesting, and I think it may be a reflection that the seriousness of what we're talking about, the concerns, mean that people might be just on a level, just want to raise that concern or in some kind of way. So there's not so much of a question as to whether they should raise it, maybe, I wonder. And that they've tried to raise it with their employer. I mean, that's really interesting for those that are running organisations and regulatory bodies, the fact that people are willing to go to their employer. I think the reason we called, and it's replicated across other sectors, incidentally, maybe not to the same level, but the reason we called the whistleblowing story the inside story is because that was the prevailing kind of message from the data. But a word of caution, I haven't got teased out in this data, but from the inside story, it was quite clear that people don't persist raising their concerns. They will raise it once or twice with their employer, and generally they will say silent with the concerns. Now, I can't draw that from this data because I didn't have time to apply that to the situation, to the research, but I think I would be very surprised if they didn't, if a similar thing did not happen within this sector, this type of wrongdoing as well. And then the most prominent reaction was no response to the whistleblower. The majority of people speaking to us have been victimised in some kind of way or have been dismissed. And whistleblowers raised their concerns are ignored by their employer, so we've just gone through that in terms of the whistleblowers who speak to us feel that their concerns have been ignored at some level, whether that's a perception issue or whether it's lack of feedback or an actual kind of fact that the concerns haven't been addressed. It is kind of open to, it is sort of, depends on the scenario really. And I wanted to next talk about what can be done, organisations and regulators can do to kind of meet these challenges and to kind of create a system where whistleblowing concerns are looked at. I think a lot of the time, I speak to a lot of organisations, I do training as part of my role as well, and often I'm trying to, when I'm talking to managers who might be part of the whistleblowing arrangements or that kind of thing, it's usually about trying to make managers aware that they should be looking past whatever's going on with the whistleblower, whoever they are, what kind of circumstances they are, what kind of preconceived notions they might have about that individual, and try to focus on the substance of the concern they're raising so that the risk or whatever it might be can be looked at properly and kind of addressed. And so organisations, as I said, they've got an opportunity here, especially in this space, of raising concern, of dealing with concerns because people are raising it internally, and they are raising the concerns, it seems to me, from our data. And so it's about having arrangements in place internally that take advantage of that information, and so that managers are properly trained, and that there's a variety of kind of options for people to use to raise the concerns, just in case maybe the line manager's failed in dealing with the concerns, so the concern's been ignored, or maybe the line manager's involved or implicated in something. And so also, there's no legal requirement on organisations to have whistleblowing arrangements, but there is laws around protecting whistleblowers in the sense of against victimisation. So part of the whistleblowing policy should make it clear that victimisation won't be tolerated and managers or anybody who victimises a whistleblower will be disciplined. But in terms of whistleblowing arrangements, which includes like a policy and obviously then the way that's implemented by managers, good whistleblowing arrangements will have some other side effects, will have some other benefits to sort of the culture that exists in the workplace. So one thing it will do, it will deter wrongdoing. If you have a system where you're unsure if the person next to you is going to be a whistleblower, that will deter people from acting in a legal way, or will sharpen up practice, potentially. It will detect wrongdoing early, so it will detect when I say wrongdoing, it will also detect a risk early, and so organisations can move to kind of deal with that before it becomes a bigger issue. It also makes management work, in the sense that often with whistleblowing arrangements, middle management make or break the arrangements. There are plenty of examples where there have been fabulous whistleblowing policies on paper that have not worked in practice because middle management either didn't know what they were doing, so concerns were raised with them and they didn't know what to do with them, or managers kind of feel threatened by it. So it's a training piece as well as a kind of accountability piece for management. And finally, the other benefit is that it will demonstrate to regulators, to outside stakeholders, that there's that the organisation is accountable because there are whistleblowing arrangements, and there are ways that you can make sure they're sort of operating effectively. Thank you. So yeah, I just also wanted to kind of follow up that last bit on some principles that organisations can follow in terms of making sure they have good arrangements in place, effective arrangements in place. And this is also relevant for regulatory bodies. These standards are increasingly being picked up by regulators as a kind of a measurement of what they expect to see. And these principles have been developed by various different bodies since the 1990s. There's a BSI code of practice as well. And the charity that I work for, produced, we set up a whistleblowing commission in 2014, and they produced a code of practice that sort of built on these sort of principles. And that's been adopted by the Financial Conduct Authority, and the principles have been implemented by the NHS through a whistleblowing review that's now going through. And in fact, the National Guardian's Office, which was mentioned a little bit earlier in the day, they're using those type of principles to now examine, to kind of regulate how whistleblowing is being implemented in the NHS. So just to run through some of these principles. So organisations in their policies should be very explicit about how they take malpractice seriously, and giving examples of the type of concerns that can be raised through the whistleblowing policy, and that it distinguishes between a whistleblowing concern and a grievance. So i.e., we're going back to that definition of whistleblowing, that the system is picking up where someone is a witness to wrongdoing. It's not about their personal position, if you like, through the grievance. And also, I think in terms of leadership, I thought it was interesting what the CQC inspector was saying about kind of the prominence of kind of the leader in terms of how, when they're sort of judging an organisation through outstanding. That's also key for whistleblowing. If it has buy-in from the top, you're probably going to have more buy-in from managers below that person. And it will kind of encourage whistleblowers as well, potentially, because they will see that the organisation is taking it seriously. So staff have an option to raise concerns outside the line management. That makes sense. Sort of named contacts, places you could go to kind of, as a safety valve really, in case line management aren't listening or involved in some way. Staff are enabled to access confidential advice from an independent body. I mean, that's why we're here as a charity, to provide that independent advice. Trade unions can do that too, but having that kind of source of advice is really key, and the employer kind of highlighting that is kind of important for whistleblowing arrangements. Some people will feel they need advice. So staff are able to, the organisation will request, will give confidentiality, respect confidentiality if it's requested. Yeah, so obviously there are functions in there so that people can raise concerns confidentially. And there is a difference between someone confidentially raising a concern. So that's the idea that you go to an organisation, they offer to protect your identity. So they're going to investigate in a way that doesn't reveal who you are, from an anonymous disclosure. So where it's like an anonymised email, a kind of a letter in the post. I didn't have a chance to pick up with the CQC lady, but I thought it was interesting that she said they have vague whistleblowing concerns. And I did wonder whether that was, they got a lot of anonymous disclosures, which kind of says something, can say a lot about your organisation or the sector if they don't feel confident to kind of approach you on a confidential or an open basis. So that's interesting. I think it's more worrying if it's an organisation, because that would probably may say that the staff don't trust the processes. But also confidentiality, there are limits to it in the sense, practical limits. Obviously, if somebody works in a small workplace or they've witnessed an incident that nobody else other than the kind of perpetrator has witnessed, if it's a physical abuse, you're not really going to be able to guarantee their confidentiality. So I think then it comes back to this training point again for managers. This is not difficult concepts to get your head around, but I think you do have to engage with them when you're kind of confronted with that type of issue, because it will give you a grounding as to the practicalities of this that can be missed. It happens time and time again, and the whistleblower assumes that there's going to be confidentiality. They assume that that's just part of the kind of process. And also legally, you may not be able to protect someone's identity if you're going through, a safeguarding kind of investigation or some process that maybe calls in an outside regulator or body. Obviously, when and how, managers and the organisation have to obviously be aware of when regulators need to be called in or law enforcement. I'm no safeguarding expert in itself, but I'd imagine there are quite tight rules about when you call in those bodies. It's certainly something I've come across on the advice line. Again, making it a disciplinary offence to victimise a whistleblower. And this distinction between someone being malicious, making a maliciously false allegation. This is the idea that what happens if the whistleblower has an agenda? And it has to be more than just that. I think human nature is, as it kind of is, you keep an eye on the people that you don't like, I think. And I kind of feel that that's something that should be looked past and looked at the substance of the concern. So that was what I was talking about earlier. But if it's malicious and false, because people can obviously also raise concerns if they become aware of something, but they don't have the full picture until it's been properly looked at, they may be wrong in a certain assumption. And so you don't want to really discipline somebody in that position. But where it's malicious and false, that's the kind of definition we work at, where a whistleblower might, that might be the position where you start to maybe look at sort of disciplining somebody in that situation. And again, talking about training, so making sure that there's training all through the organisation, so awareness training for workers, training for managers in how to kind of interact and handle concerns and handle the whistleblower. We provide that incidentally if anybody's interested. And finally, from a board level, conducting periodic reviews and audits of the effectiveness of whistleblowing arrangements. This is like a new area for best practice in whistleblowing. It's kind of trying to figure out, well, what is an effective whistleblowing arrangements? How many concerns raised should indicate that it's a good or bad system, which is a very difficult question to answer in itself. And it's more about looking at maybe some of the other information that might be around that. So sort of like grievances, outside litigation, talking to trade unions. Because high or low numbers can be quite confusing. If you've got a low number, does that mean that staff don't trust those arrangements? High numbers, does that mean there's like lots of wrongdoing going on, but people trust the system? It's kind of, I think the number of whistleblowing concerns through the system is, on its own, is actually quite a confusing number sometimes. So there's got to be other bits of information that you can look at, including things like staff surveys as well and focus groups. I mean, that's really geared towards larger organisations, obviously, but I think it is relevant. It's kind of the expanding part of this kind of area. And that's it, really, from me.
Thank you, Andrew.